When they took Maduro, they crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. International law died that day, and Ibrahim Traoré knew, if they could kidnap a president in his own capital, no leader in the global south was safe. So he did something unprecedented. He united them. January 3, 2026. 2 a.m. Venezuelan time. The explosions began. American bombers struck infrastructure across Caracas, military installations, communication towers, power grids. Delta Force commandos descended on President Nicolás Maduro's residence. His security team fought back. Dozens died protecting him. But the assault was overwhelming. Within 45 minutes, Maduro and his wife Celia Flores were captured, blindfolded, and flown to the USS Iwo Jima. By dawn, President Donald Trump posted a photo on social media. Maduro, in a gray sweatsuit, blindfolded, holding a water bottle aboard an American warship. The caption was triumphant. The message was clear. America could reach anyone, anywhere. The stated justification? Narco-terrorism charges filed in a New York court. But everyone knew the real reason. Maduro had refused to bend. He had rejected American demands to step down, refused exile offers, and continued to govern Venezuela independently. So, they took him by force. The reaction from global leaders was silence. Calculated, diplomatic silence. European nations issued generic statements about concern for regional stability. The United Nations called an emergency session, but took no concrete action. Even nations that privately opposed the operation said nothing publicly. Because openly challenging the United States carried consequences. But 3,000 miles away in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré was watching, and he wasn't staying silent. January 4th, 6 p.m. West Africa time. Traoré called an emergency cabinet meeting. His advisors were nervous. "Mr. President," one said carefully, "this is between the United States and Venezuela. We should issue a standard diplomatic statement and avoid—" Traoré cut him off. "Avoid what? Telling the truth? If we stay silent when they kidnap a head of state, we're complicit." "But sir, the economic consequences are already here," Traoré said. "You think if we stay quiet, they'll leave us alone?" Maduro stayed quiet when they sanctioned him, when they attempted coups against him, when they tried to bribe his pilot to hijack his plane. And now he's in a Manhattan prison cell. Silence doesn't protect us. It just delays the inevitable. He stood and addressed the room. "Schedule a live national address, tonight, and contact every African Union member state, every BRICS nation, every Latin American leader who will listen. Tell them I'm speaking publicly about Venezuela, and I'm inviting them to join me." At 9 p.m., Ibrahim Traoré appeared on national television. But this wasn't just a Burkinabe broadcast. Through Pan-African media networks and social media live streams, his speech reached millions across Africa, Latin America, and the global south. He wore his military uniform. No script, no teleprompter, just a camera and the truth. Fellow citizens, brothers and sisters across Africa and the global south, I speak to you tonight about an act that should terrify every independent nation on earth. Yesterday, the United States military bombed Venezuela, a sovereign country that posed no threat to American territory. They killed Venezuelan soldiers and civilians. They destroyed infrastructure, and they kidnapped President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, flew them to a warship, and are now holding them in an American prison. He paused, letting the gravity settle. The United States calls this a law enforcement operation. But let me be very clear about what this actually is. This is an act of war. This is state terrorism. This is the abduction of a democratically elected leader from his own country. And this is what happens when one nation believes it has the right to kidnap, bomb, and occupy any country that refuses to obey. His voice hardened. They didn't invade Venezuela because of narco-terrorism charges. Those are pretexts, legal fiction designed to justify imperial action. They invaded because Maduro refused to surrender Venezuelan sovereignty, because he wouldn't hand over Venezuela's oil to American corporations, because he dared to govern his own country according to his own people's wishes rather than Washington's demands. Traore leaned forward, speaking directly to the camera. And here's what terrifies me, and should terrify every leader in the global South. If they can bomb Caracas and kidnap Maduro, they can do it anywhere, to anyone. What international law prevents them now? What institution will defend us? The United Nations held a meeting and did nothing. The International Criminal Court says nothing. Europe expresses concern but takes no action. The entire architecture of international law collapsed yesterday. And the message is clear. If you defy Western power, you can be removed by force. No trial, no process, just bombs and special forces. He stood, pacing slightly as he spoke. Some will say I shouldn't speak about this, that it's not Africa's business, that we should stay quiet to avoid consequences. But that thinking is exactly why we keep losing. Maduro stayed quiet when they sanctioned him. Gaddafi tried to negotiate when they came for him. Sankara trusted the wrong people, and all of them were removed, not because they broke laws, but because they refused to be puppets. His voice rose with conviction. So, I'm not staying quiet. I'm saying what needs to be said. The kidnapping of Nicolás Maduro is illegal under international law. It is an act of aggression that violates the UN Charter, the Vienna Convention, and every principle of sovereignty. And Africa stands with Venezuela, not because we agree with everything Maduro does, but because we recognize that an attack on one sovereign nation is a threat to all sovereign nations. Then Traore did something unprecedented. He issued a direct challenge. I call on every African Union member state to condemn this operation. I call on BRICS nations to issue a joint statement declaring that the abduction of heads of state will not be tolerated. I call on Latin American countries to stand with Venezuela, not just with words, but with action. And I call on the United States to return President Maduro and his wife to Venezuela immediately, or face unified global South opposition. He outlined specific proposals: economic sanctions against nations participating in the operation, a joint security framework for global South leaders, and a new international legal body that wasn't controlled by Western powers. Because the current system, he said, is not designed to protect us, it's designed to control us, and we need to build something new, together. The speech lasted 12 minutes. Within an hour, it had been viewed 15 million times. Within 24 hours, over 100 million. Hashtags trended globally. Sure stand with Venezuela. Traore speaks truth. Just global South unity. And then something remarkable happened. Other leaders began speaking out. Bolivia's president issued a statement echoing Traore's call for Maduro's return. Cuba condemned the operation as imperial piracy. South Africa's governing party called it a violation of sovereignty. Nicaragua, Iran, China, and Russia all issued formal condemnations. Even leaders who had stayed silent initially began responding to pressure from their own citizens, who had seen Traore's speech and were demanding their governments take a stand. Within 72 hours, over 40 nations had condemned the operation. The African Union passed a resolution demanding Maduro's release. BRICS nations coordinated a diplomatic response, and at the UN, countries from the global South blocked resolutions that would have legitimized the American action. The United States responded with predictable fury. State Department officials called Traore's speech irresponsible and inflammatory. American media outlets accused him of defending a dictator and undermining international justice. Sanctions threats were floated privately. But Traoré didn't back down. In a follow-up press conference, he addressed the criticism directly. "They call me irresponsible for defending international law. They accuse me of supporting dictatorship while they literally kidnapped an elected president. This is the colonial playbook. When we resist, they call us radicals. When we demand sovereignty, they call us dangerous. When we refuse to submit, they call us criminals. I reject their framing entirely." He continued, "And to those who say Maduro is a dictator who deserves this, even if that were true, which I dispute, it wouldn't justify invasion and kidnapping. Either we have international law or we don't. Either sovereignty means something or it doesn't. You can't have a system where powerful nations decide which leaders are legitimate and which can be abducted. That's not justice. That's empire." The global impact of Traoré's response went beyond speeches. It catalyzed action. African nations accelerated plans for a continental security framework. Latin American countries revived regional defense agreements, and a coalition of Global South nations began drafting an alternative legal charter for international relations, one that explicitly prohibited the kind of operation carried out against Venezuela. In Caracas, Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, now leading the government in Maduro's absence, publicly thanked Traoré. "In our darkest hour," she said, "when powerful forces tried to silence us, African voices rose in our defense." Ibrahim Traoré reminded the world that sovereignty is not negotiable, that dignity cannot be bombed into submission. Venezuela will remember. In New York, Maduro himself, held in a detention center, awaiting trial, received word of Traoré's speech through his lawyers. According to reports, he smiled for the first time since his capture. "Tell him," Maduro reportedly said, "that the revolution has many leaders. If they take one, another rises. That's what makes us unstoppable." 3 weeks after the kidnapping, Traoré convened an emergency summit in Addis Ababa. Leaders from 30 African, Latin American, and Asian nations attended. The agenda: creating a mutual defense framework for Global South leaders. In his opening remarks, Traoré laid out the stakes. What happened to Maduro can happen to any of us. Today, it's Venezuela. Tomorrow, it could be Burkina Faso, or Bolivia, or South Africa, or anywhere that dares to chart an independent path. So, we have a choice. We can wait for them to come for us one by one, or we can stand together and make it clear that an attack on one is an attack on all. The summit produced a joint declaration. Any military operation against a signatory nation's leadership would trigger collective diplomatic, economic, and political response. It wasn't a military alliance, yet, but it was a warning. Touch one, face all. The Maduro kidnapping had been intended as a display of American power, a message that resistance was futile. But Ibrahim Traoré's response transformed it into a rallying cry. It exposed the brittleness of a global order built on force rather than law, and it demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming power, solidarity could become a form of resistance. Months later, as Maduro's trial dragged on in Manhattan and Venezuela's government continued to function under Rodriguez's leadership, a journalist asked Traoré if he feared retaliation for his outspoken stance. Traoré smiled slightly. "Fear? Of course I fear. I'm not stupid. But I fear silence more. Because silence is what they count on. They kidnap a president and wait to see if anyone will speak. If we stay quiet, they learn they can do it again. If we speak, we remind them that the world is watching, that there are still nations who believe in sovereignty, that there are still leaders who won't bend." He added, Maduro is in a prison cell. But his ideas, the idea that nations should control their own resources, that leaders should serve their people rather than foreign powers, those ideas can't be imprisoned. And as long as voices like ours keep speaking them, they'll never be silenced. The kidnapping of Nicolás Maduro changed international politics, but Ibrahim Traoré's response changed how the global South saw itself, not as isolated nations waiting to be picked off, but as a collective force that could resist, unite, and demand a different world. And sometimes, that's how empires begin to crack. Not from military defeats, but from the realization that their victims refuse to stay silent.